The rain had been falling on Hacksaw Ridge since dawn, turning the coral limestone into a treacherous slope that claimed almost as many casualties as enemy fire. Private First Class Bobby Chen watched the drops cascade over the cliff's edge, disappearing into the mist 200 feet below where the 77th Infantry Division's aid station waited. The rope they'd rigged that morning hung wet and heavy against the rock face, its hemp fibers already darkening with moisture. "That thing's gonna snap before noon," Chen muttered, testing the anchor point one more time. The metal stake driven into a crack in the coral felt solid enough, but everything on Okinawa seemed designed to give way under pressure. Desmond Doss knelt nearby, checking his medical supplies for the third time since first light. His hands moved with practiced efficiency through bandages, sulfur powder, and morphine syrettes. But Chen noticed the slight tremor that hadn't been there when they'd first climbed this ridge 3 days ago. The same tremor that seemed to affect everyone who'd spent more than 48 hours on the plateau above. "You sure about staying up here when the company pulls back?" Chen asked, though he already knew the answer. Doss had that look again, the quiet stubbornness that had gotten him through basic training despite refusing to touch a rifle. The same expression that had carried him through 2 previous actions where his squad mates had watched him walk into fire that should have killed him twice over. "Can't leave them up there," Doss replied, his voice barely audible over the rain drumming against their helmets. "Not while they're still breathing." The ridge stretched ahead of them like a moonscape of shell craters and shattered trees. Somewhere in that maze of coral outcroppings and cave mouths, the Japanese had constructed a defense that had already cost the 77th Infantry Division more casualties than anyone wanted to count. The morning's attack had pushed them 50 yards forward at the cost of half the company, leaving wounded men scattered across the plateau with no clear way to retrieve them. Chen had seen the evacuation plan sketched on a rain-soaked map 30 minutes ago. The company would withdraw to the base of the ridge, regroup, and wait for artillery to soften the Japanese positions before attempting another assault. It was sound tactical thinking that ignored one critical detail, the wounded men calling medic from foxholes and shell craters across the plateau. "Command says we've got 20 minutes before the pullback," Chen said, adjusting his rifle sling. The weapon felt heavier each day, though he couldn't decide if that was exhaustion or the growing weight of what he'd been asked to do with it. "That's not enough time to reach half those boys." Doss stood slowly, shouldering his aid bag with movements that suggested reserves of strength Chen couldn't quite understand. The medic had been awake for 36 hours, had already made 4 trips across the exposed ground to retrieve wounded, and still spoke in the same soft voice that had once annoyed Chen with its steadiness. "Then we better get started," Doss said. Lieutenant Morrison appeared through the drizzle, his uniform as mud-stained as everyone else's, but his bearing still crisp with the authority that kept their small section functioning. He moved with the careful efficiency of an officer who'd learned to read terrain, weather, and enemy positions in the span of 3 weeks that felt like 3 years. "Doss," Morrison called, "I need you to understand something. When that whistle blows, this ridge belongs to the Japanese again. We can't hold it, can't support anyone who stays behind." "Yes, sir. I understand." Morrison studied the medic's face, looking for something Chen couldn't identify. Fear, maybe, or the kind of rational self-preservation that would make this conversation easier. Instead, he found the same quiet resolve that had already saved 8 men from this ridge and made Morrison's casualty reports slightly less devastating than they might have been. "The rope will hold 1 man at a time," Morrison continued, "maybe 2 if they're both light. But if you're up here alone when they start their counterattack—" "I know, sir." The lieutenant nodded once, a gesture that carried more weight than any formal order. Chen watched the exchange with growing unease, recognizing the moment when leadership shifted from command structure to individual conscience. Morrison was giving Doss permission to stay, but the responsibility would rest entirely on the medic's shoulders. Across the plateau, a voice called out through the rain. Weak, desperate, unmistakably American. Chen felt his stomach tighten as he counted the distance. 150 yards through open ground, past at least 2 known sniper positions, to reach whoever was calling. It might as well have been a mile. Doss was already moving, checking his supplies one final time, before stepping out of the shallow depression that had served as their command post. His movements carried the deliberate calm Chen had learned to associate with moments when the medic seemed to hear something the rest of them couldn't. A voice, a prayer, a sense of purpose that transcended the tactical situation. "Chen," Morrison said quietly, "when that whistle blows, you come down that rope, no matter what's happening up here." "Yes, sir." But as Chen watched Doss disappear into the maze of craters and coral outcroppings, he wondered if following orders would prove as simple as acknowledging them. The rope stretched wet and dark over the cliff's edge, and somewhere on the plateau above, wounded men were calling for help that seemed mathematically impossible to deliver. The rain continued to fall, and in the distance, the sound of enemy movement suggested that Hacksaw Ridge was about to become even more dangerous than it already was. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. The first wounded man Doss reached was Corporal Martinez from 2nd Squad, gut-shot and conscious enough to know how bad his situation was. He'd crawled into a shell crater 30 yards from the ridge's eastern edge, far enough from the cliff to make extraction complicated, but close enough to hear the rain drumming against the coral below. "Thought you boys had pulled back already," Martinez whispered, his voice thin with pain and something that might have been relief. Doss knelt in the muddy bottom of the crater, his hands already working to assess damage he couldn't see clearly in the grey morning light. The wound was clean through the abdomen, bleeding steadily but not catastrophically. Martinez would live if they could get him down to the aid station within the hour. "If. Company's moving out in 15 minutes, Doss said, applying pressure bandages with movements that had become automatic after 3 days on the ridge. "But we're getting you down first." The sound of distant small arms fire echoed from the northern section of the plateau, where scattered remnants of 1st and 3rd Squads were still trying to extract their own wounded. Doss could hear Lieutenant Morrison's voice carried on the wind, calling coordinates for covering fire that wouldn't come. Artillery support had been suspended until American forces cleared the ridge. "Can't carry me that far," Martinez said, and he was right. The crater sat 100 yards from the cliff edge, through ground that offered no concealment and at least 3 confirmed sniper positions. A stretcher carry would expose both men for 5 minutes of open movement, assuming they could maintain any speed with Martinez's dead weight, but the rope might work. Doss had rigged similar systems during training, using whatever anchor points the terrain provided to lower wounded men down slopes too steep for conventional evacuation. The coral formations on Hacksaw Ridge were solid enough, and the hemp line they'd brought up that morning was rated for 300 pounds. "We're going to drag you to the cliff," Doss explained, checking Martinez's pulse and finding it steady, despite the blood loss. "Then lower you down on the stretcher. Going to hurt, but you'll be drinking coffee in the aid station before noon." Martinez managed something that might have been a laugh. "You always this optimistic, Doc?" "Just stubborn." The evacuation whistle sounded from the command post, sharp and urgent through the rain. Doss could hear boots scraping against coral as the remaining men of their section began moving toward the cliff edge and the rope that would carry them down to safety. In 5 minutes, maybe 10, Hacksaw Ridge would belong entirely to the Japanese defenders who'd been waiting 3 days for exactly this moment. Doss grabbed Martinez under the shoulders and began dragging him toward the cliff. The wounded man bit back a scream as movement tore at damaged tissue, but he stayed conscious and even tried to help by pushing with his legs when the ground allowed it. They covered 50 yards before the first sniper round cracked past Doss's helmet. "Contact left," Martinez gasped, though both men were too exposed to do anything about enemy fire except move faster and hope the rain affected Japanese marksmanship as much as it did American. The cliff edge appeared through the mist like a gateway between life and death. Below, Doss could see the scattered figures of his company reaching the base of the ridge, tiny shapes moving with the urgent efficiency of men who'd learned to read the rhythm of Japanese counterattacks. Above, the plateau stretched empty, except for the scattered gear of a failed assault and the wounded men who couldn't move fast enough to join the retreat. Private Chen waited at the rope anchor point, his rifle trained on the tree line, where muzzle flashes had started appearing with increasing frequency. He'd already rigged the stretcher to the hemp line, testing knots with the desperate precision of someone whose life might depend on their holding. "Company's at the bottom," Chen reported. "Morrison says you've got maybe 10 minutes before they start moving in strength." Doss helped Martinez onto the stretcher, securing him with straps that had been improvised from web gear and parachute cord. The wounded man's face was pale with shock and blood loss, but his eyes remained focused and grateful in a way that made the risk feel less like madness and more like simple necessity. "See you at the bottom, Doc," Martinez whispered. The descent took 3 minutes that felt like 30. Chen and Doss lowered the stretcher hand over hand, while Japanese rifle fire began probing their position with increasing accuracy. The hemp line stretched and creaked under Martinez's weight, shedding fibers that floated down toward the aid station like snow. When the rope finally went slack, signaling the stretcher had reached bottom, Doss hauled the line back up and looked across the plateau. 2 more voices were calling through the rain, distant but clear enough to triangulate. Both wounded, both American, both depending on decisions that had already moved beyond military protocol into the realm of individual conscience. Chen was watching him with an expression that mixed admiration with something that might have been fear. "Doc, they're going to be coming over that ridge in force. You stay up here, you're staying alone." "I know. And that rope's not going to hold forever. Look at it." Doss examined the hemp line and saw what Chen meant. The constant friction against coral had frayed the outer fibers, exposing the rope's core to moisture and stress that would weaken it with each additional use. Maybe it would handle 2 more descents, maybe 5. Impossible to know without testing it with loads. It might not survive. "Get yourself down," Doss said, checking his medical supplies and finding them sufficient for perhaps 2 more casualties if he was careful with the sulfur powder. "Tell Lieutenant Morrison I'll be along." Chen nodded once, a gesture that carried the weight of understanding, something that couldn't be explained in any after-action report. He tested his gear, checked his rifle, and disappeared over the cliff edge with the practiced efficiency of a soldier who'd learned to balance fear and duty in equal measure. Doss was alone on Hacksaw Ridge, with wounded men calling his name through the rain. The second casualty was Private Williamson from 3rd Squad, and Doss found him wedged between 2 coral outcroppings 100 yards from where Martinez had been lying. Williamson had taken shrapnel in both legs and couldn't move without help, but he was conscious and alert enough to provide useful intelligence about enemy positions. 3 machine gun nests in the caves up north, he reported, as Doss worked to stop the bleeding. Maybe a dozen riflemen in spider holes along the western edge. They're letting us get close, then opening up all at once. The bandaging took 10 minutes, precious time that Doss could measure in the increasing volume of Japanese voices echoing from concealed positions around the plateau. They were moving into assault positions, preparing to sweep the ridge clear of any remaining American presence. Standard tactics that left maybe 20 minutes before the ridge became completely untenable. But 20 minutes might be enough. The rope had held for Martinez, and Williamson weighed perhaps 30 pounds less. If Doss could get him to the cliff edge without drawing concentrated fire, the evacuation might work again. If the hemp line didn't snap under stress, if the anchor point remained solid, if a dozen other variables aligned in ways that seemed increasingly unlikely. "How many others you figure are still up here?" Williamson asked as Doss helped him toward the cliff. Don't know. 3, maybe 4 voices I heard calling. And you're planning to get them all down on that rope? Doss didn't answer directly, focusing instead on the immediate problem of crossing 60 yards of open ground, while Japanese snipers adjusted their positions for better fields of fire. But the question hung between them like a challenge to basic mathematics and tactical reality. The cliff edge materialized through the rain like salvation, and Doss felt genuine relief as he secured Williamson to the stretcher. The wounded man's legs were a mess of bandages and improvised splints, but the bleeding had stopped and his pulse remained strong. He'd walk again, assuming they could get him down to the surgical tent without the rope failing. "Doc," Williamson said as Doss prepared to lower him. "What you're doing up here, it's not normal. You understand that, right?" "Maybe not. But you're doing it anyway." Doss began the descent, feeling the rope stretch under Williamson's weight as fibers continued separating under stress. The hemp line was noticeably thinner now, worn to perhaps 70% of its original diameter. Still functional, but showing signs of fatigue that made each additional use increasingly dangerous. 200 feet below, he could see activity around the aid station. Stretchers being loaded into ambulances, medical personnel working with the urgent efficiency of men who expected incoming wounded. Martinez was probably being prepped for surgery already, one life saved out of the dozens they'd lost taking this ridge. The rope went slack, and Doss hauled it back up to find several more strands had parted during Williamson's descent. He examined the line carefully, testing its strength against his own weight and finding it still serviceable but degraded beyond any safety margin he would normally accept. From across the plateau, another voice called through the rain. Weak, desperate, but unmistakably American and close enough to locate. Somewhere near the northern edge, where Williamson had reported the machine gun positions, in ground that offered excellent concealment for Japanese defenders and almost no cover for anyone trying to reach wounded men. Doss reloaded his medical supplies and started moving north. Behind him, the rope hung over the cliff edge like a lifeline that might not survive another use. Ahead, the sound of enemy movement suggested that his window of opportunity was closing faster than tactical logic suggested was wise. But the voice was calling his name now, and Doss had learned to trust the arithmetic of individual need over the larger calculations of military necessity. One more man, one more trip to the rope, one more descent that might work if the hemp held and the Japanese didn't coordinate their fire effectively. He found Sergeant Walsh in a crater 50 yards from the cliff, unconscious but breathing with the shallow rhythm that suggested serious internal injuries. Walsh was a big man, easily 200 pounds, and the kind of career non-commissioned officer who'd made Doss's early weeks with the company more difficult than they needed to be. But rank and personality meant nothing when a man was bleeding in a shell hole with enemy troops closing from 3 directions. Doss checked Walsh's pulse and found it weak but steady. Possible concussion, definite internal bleeding, but stable enough to survive evacuation if they could reach the cliff before Japanese forces swept this section of the ridge. Walsh would need to be dragged dead weight across ground that offered no concealment and increasingly accurate enemy fire. The evacuation took 15 minutes, with Doss stopping twice to adjust bandages, and once to wait out a burst of machine gun fire that came close enough to spray coral fragments across both men. Walsh regained consciousness as they reached the cliff, his eyes focusing with difficulty on Doss's face. "Thought you'd pulled back with the company," he mumbled. "Not yet, Sergeant. How many times you been up and down that rope?" "This'll be the 3rd. Walsh studied the frayed hemp line with professional interest, noting the separated fibers and worn spots that made the rope's condition obvious even to a wounded man. "That thing's not going to hold much longer." "Maybe not. But you're sending me down anyway." "Yes, Sergeant." Walsh nodded slowly, a gesture that carried more respect than he'd ever shown Doss during their months of training together. "Always figured you for soft, Doc. Turns out I was wrong about what soft means." The descent was agonizing, with the rope stretching further than before, and several strands parting audibly as Walsh's weight tested the line's remaining integrity. But it held, barely, lowering the sergeant to safety as Japanese voices grew louder from positions that seemed to be closing from multiple directions. When Doss hauled the rope back up for what might be its final use, he could see that perhaps half the original fibers remained intact. The line might support one more descent, or it might fail immediately. Impossible to predict, but definitely beyond any reasonable safety standard. From the northern section of the plateau, 2 more voices were calling through the rain. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The 4th wounded man was Private Jenkins, barely 19 years old and calling for his mother in a voice that carried across the plateau with heartbreaking clarity. Doss found him in a crater near the ridge's northeastern corner, conscious, but going into shock from blood loss and a compound fracture that had left his right leg twisted at an impossible angle. "Doc," Jenkins whispered as Doss knelt beside him, "I can't feel my legs." "That's the shock talking," Doss replied, though he wasn't certain. The leg wound was severe enough to require immediate surgery, and spinal damage remained a possibility that wouldn't be confirmed until Jenkins reached the aid station. What mattered now was stopping the bleeding and getting him down the rope before the hemp line failed entirely. The bandaging took precious time, with Doss working by feel as much as sight in the grey morning light. Behind them, Japanese voices were growing closer, and the occasional rifle shot suggested enemy troops were beginning to probe the ridge systematically. Standard tactics called for them to sweep from north to south, clearing any remaining American presence before establishing their own defensive positions. That gave Doss perhaps 10 minutes to reach the cliff edge with Jenkins before organized resistance became impossible. 10 minutes to cross 40 yards of open ground with a wounded man who couldn't walk and weighed enough to make the rope's survival questionable. "How many others you got up here?" Jenkins asked, as Doss improvised a stretcher from his poncho and 2 broken rifle stocks. "One more that I know of. Maybe others. And you're going to get them all down?" "Going to try." Jenkins managed something that might have been a laugh. "My old man always said medics were crazy. Guess he was right." The evacuation was complicated by Jenkins' inability to help with his own movement and the increasingly accurate Japanese fire that forced them to stop twice and take cover in shell craters barely large enough for 2 men. But they reached the cliff edge as the last intact strands of the rope groaned under tension that suggested imminent failure. Doss secured Jenkins to the makeshift stretcher with strips torn from web gear, testing each knot twice before committing the wounded man's life to a hemp line that had already exceeded any reasonable operational limit. The rope looked like something that belonged in a scrap pile rather than a tactical evacuation, but it was all they had. "See you at the bottom," Jenkins said, and Doss began the descent. The hemp line stretched almost to its breaking point, fibers separating with small popping sounds that carried clearly despite the rain and distant gunfire. Doss could feel the rope's diameter decreasing under his hands as individual strands gave way under stress, but somehow the core held long enough to lower Jenkins to safety. When he hauled the line back up, Doss found himself holding what amounted to a few dozen hemp fibers twisted together in a configuration that might support 50 pounds under ideal conditions. Certainly not enough for another evacuation, and barely sufficient to get him down the cliff if he went immediately. But from the western edge of the plateau, a voice was still calling through the rain. Corporal Hendricks from 1st Squad had been hit in the chest and was coughing blood when Doss found him. The wound was serious but not immediately fatal, and Hendricks remained conscious enough to understand their tactical situation with perfect clarity. "Rope's finished, isn't it?" he asked as Doss worked to dress the chest wound. "Pretty much." "So how you planning to get me down?" Doss had been asking himself the same question during the 20-minute crawl from the cliff edge to Hendricks' position. The rope wouldn't hold another man. Improvising a replacement was impossible with available materials, and Japanese forces were close enough now that their voices carried clearly through the rain. But the cliff face itself offered possibilities. The coral limestone had been carved by centuries of erosion into a series of ledges and outcroppings that might provide handholds for a careful descent. Dangerous under the best conditions, probably suicidal with a wounded man, but potentially survivable if they moved slowly and tested each position before committing their full weight. "We're going to climb down," Doss explained. "Take it slow, one move at a time." Hendricks stared at him with an expression that suggested serious doubt about both the plan and Doss's mental stability. "Doc, I got a hole in my chest, and you want to take me rock climbing?" "Unless you've got a better idea." "Fair point." The descent began at the cliff's eastern edge, where the limestone had formed a series of natural steps leading down toward a ledge about 30 feet below. Doss went first, testing each handhold and calling back instructions, while Hendricks followed with movements made clumsy by pain and blood loss. They made it 20 feet before Hendricks slipped. Doss caught him by the wrist, both men hanging from handholds that suddenly felt inadequate for supporting two people. Below them, the cliff fell away into mist and rain for another 150 feet. Above, Japanese voices suggested that enemy troops had reached the cliff edge and were beginning to investigate the rope anchor point. "Can't hold on much longer," Hendricks gasped. "Yes, you can." Doss found a foothold that would support both their weight and helped Hendricks re-establish his grip on the coral. The wounded man was pale with shock and exhaustion, but his hands remained steady and his breathing was controlled despite the chest wound that made every movement painful. They continued down one handhold at a time, with Doss checking each position before allowing Hendricks to follow. The rain made everything slippery, and the limestone crumbled under pressure in ways that turned each move into a calculated risk. But somehow they kept descending foot by foot toward the ledge that might provide a rest stop before the final 100 feet of cliff face. Above them, rifle fire erupted as Japanese troops discovered the abandoned rope and began searching for the Americans who'd been using it. Voices called in rapid Japanese, coordinating a search that would inevitably discover the two men clinging to handholds 30 feet down the cliff face. Doss helped Hendricks onto the ledge just as the first enemy soldier appeared at the cliff edge above them. For a moment, their eyes met across 90 feet of misty air. American medic and Japanese infantrymen, both young, both exhausted, both following orders that had brought them to this impossible place. The soldier raised his rifle and Doss pressed himself against the limestone, while pulling Hendricks deeper into the shadows of an overhang that might provide concealment for a few more minutes. Rifle fire cracked against the cliff face, sending coral fragments spinning down toward the aid station that seemed impossibly far below. But they were alive, and the ledge was wide enough to rest for a moment before attempting the final descent to safety. The Japanese soldier who spotted them from the cliff edge above couldn't have been more than 18 years old. Doss saw his face clearly in the moment before the boy raised his rifle. Exhaustion, fear, and the kind of desperate determination that came from months of fighting a war that had already lasted too long for everyone involved. What the after-action reports would never record was the 3 seconds of hesitation before the first shot, when the enemy soldier stared down at 2 men clinging to a cliff face in the rain and seemed to recognize something human that complicated his orders. Those 3 seconds gave Doss time to pull Hendricks deeper under the limestone overhang, possibly saving both their lives. The rifle fire that followed was methodical, but not particularly accurate. Hasty shots from a difficult angle by someone who might have been aiming to miss as much as to hit. Bullets cracked against the coral above and below their position, but none came close enough to force them off the narrow ledge where they'd found temporary shelter. "Kid's not much of a marksman," Hendricks observed, though his voice carried the strain of a man trying to joke about something that wasn't funny. "Maybe he doesn't want to be." Above them, Japanese voices indicated that more troops had reached the cliff edge. The conversation was brief and urgent, with what sounded like orders being given and acknowledged, then silence, followed by the distinctive metallic clink of a grenade pin being pulled. Doss pressed himself against the limestone and counted seconds. The explosion came exactly where he expected, perhaps 10 feet to their right, close enough to shower them with coral fragments, but not close enough to dislodge them from the ledge. Either poor accuracy or deliberate placement, designed to encourage retreat rather than ensure casualties. "They're trying to scare us off," he told Hendricks. "It's working." The second grenade landed closer, and the third close enough that the concussion made Doss's ears ring and his vision blur temporarily. But the overhang held, and when his hearing cleared, he could tell that the Japanese voices above had moved away from their section of the cliff edge. Either they'd decided the 2 Americans were dead, or they'd been called to more pressing duties elsewhere on the ridge. Hendricks was bleeding again, the chest wound reopened by the stress of their descent and the concussion from nearby explosions. Doss applied fresh bandages with supplies he'd been saving for emergencies worse than this one, though it was becoming difficult to imagine circumstances more desperate than clinging to a cliff face while enemy troops controlled the high ground above. "Doc," Hendricks said quietly, "what we're doing here, this isn't normal, is it?" "Probably not. But we're doing it anyway." Doss tested their next handholds, finding the limestone below the ledge more solid than the deteriorating coral they'd encountered higher up. The remaining descent looked manageable if they moved carefully, and the Japanese didn't return with more accurate weapons or better throwing arms. "What else would we do?" he asked. Hendricks considered this as Doss helped him off the ledge and onto the cliff face proper. The question seemed to require serious thought, as if there might actually be alternatives to climbing down a nearly vertical limestone wall while wounded and under fire. Give up, maybe. Wait for rescue. Surrender. Would that help anybody? Might help us. Maybe. They descended one handhold at a time through rain that was beginning to lighten, but still made every surface treacherous. Below them, Doss could see increased activity around the aid station, stretchers being moved, personnel running between tents, the urgent efficiency of a medical facility that had received 3 unexpected casualties and was preparing for more. Martinez, Williamson, Jenkins and Walsh were down there somewhere, alive because of decisions that had moved beyond military protocol into territory that Doss couldn't explain to himself, much less to anyone else. But the mathematics was simple enough. 4 men who might have died were probably going to live instead. "How many times you figure you can do this?" Hendricks asked, as they paused to rest on another small ledge. "Do what?" "Go back for one more. Climb down cliffs, get shot at by kids who look scared as we are." Doss hadn't considered the question in those terms. Each decision had felt immediate and specific. Martinez needed help, Williamson couldn't walk, Jenkins was calling for his mother, Hendricks was coughing blood. The larger pattern, if it was a pattern, remained invisible from inside the sequence of individual moments. "Don't know," he admitted. "Maybe until it stops working." "And then what?" "Then I guess we find out what comes next." They reached the bottom of the cliff as the rain finally stopped, emerging from the limestone overhang to find themselves surrounded by medical personnel who'd been watching their descent through field glasses. Hendricks was loaded onto a stretcher within seconds, his chest wound, assessed and treated with resources that made Doss's field medicine look primitive by comparison. Lieutenant Morrison appeared through the crowd of medics and orderlies, his uniform still mud-stained, but his bearing suggesting relief that bordered on disbelief. He studied Doss's face with the expression of an officer trying to understand actions that didn't fit conventional categories of courage, duty, or tactical thinking. 5 men, Morrison said quietly. Down that cliff, under fire, with a rope that should have failed after the first use. Yes, sir. How? Doss looked up toward Hacksaw Ridge, where Japanese troops were probably consolidating their defensive positions and preparing for the next American assault. The plateau looked peaceful from this distance, almost pastoral in the afternoon light that had replaced the morning's rain. Nothing in its appearance suggested the crater-scarred moonscape he'd crossed 5 times that day. "Don't know, sir." Seemed like the thing to do at the time. Morrison nodded slowly, a gesture that carried more understanding than agreement. Behind them, the wounded men Doss had brought down were being loaded into ambulances for transport to surgical facilities that might save their lives. The immediate crisis was over, but the ridge above remained in enemy hands and would have to be taken again before the week was out. What the official reports would record was clean and simple. 5 wounded men evacuated under fire by a single medic using improvised techniques and equipment. What they wouldn't capture was the sound of rain against limestone, the feel of hemp fibers separating under stress, or the moment when a young Japanese soldier aimed down from the cliff edge and seemed to hesitate before pulling the trigger. Those details would stay with Doss for the rest of his life, part of a war that would end eventually, but leave pieces of itself embedded in the memories of everyone who survived it. 47 years later, Desmond Doss sat in his kitchen in Lynchburg, Virginia, listening to rain tap against the windows and trying to explain to his grandson what Hacksaw Ridge had actually been like. The boy was 12 years old and writing a school report about Medal of Honor recipients, approaching the subject with the straightforward curiosity of someone who'd never heard artillery fire or felt a rope fray under the weight of a wounded man. "Grandpa, how many men did you really save up there?" The official citation said 75, a number that had grown over the decades through retellings and commemorative speeches. But Doss remembered 5 faces clearly: Martinez, Williamson, Jenkins, Walsh, and Hendricks, along with fragments of others whose names had been lost to time and the peculiar selectivity of memory under stress. "More than 5, he said carefully. "Less than 75. The exact number got confused in the reports." "But you remember some of them?" "Some of them." What he remembered most clearly wasn't the heroic narrative that had emerged from the action, but smaller details that had somehow survived 50 years of trying to forget them. The way hemp fibers had cut into his palms, the sound of rain against his helmet during those long crawls across the plateau, the moment when a young Japanese soldier had looked down from the cliff edge and seemed to recognize something that made killing complicated. His grandson was writing notes in a composition book, recording answers that would become part of a school presentation about American heroism in World War II. The boy's questions were earnest and careful, seeking information that would help him understand what had happened on a ridge in Okinawa during 3 hours on a rainy morning in May 1945. "Were you scared?" "Yes." "But you did it anyway?" "Yes." "Why?" Doss considered the question while watching rain stream down the kitchen window. He'd been asked similar questions thousands of times over the decades, by reporters, historians, fellow veterans, family members, and strangers who'd heard the story and wanted to understand the thinking behind actions that seemed to transcend normal calculations of risk and benefit. The honest answer was that there hadn't been much thinking involved. Each decision had felt immediate and specific, with no time for philosophical reflection about courage, duty, or the nature of heroism. Men were wounded and calling for help. He was a medic with supplies and knowledge that might save their lives. The rope was there, the cliff was there, and the choice was simple, even if the execution was complicated. "Because they needed help," he said finally, "and I was there to help them. But other people would have followed orders and left with the company. Maybe, probably. So why didn't you?" This was the question that had followed Doss through 5 decades of trying to return to civilian life after the war. Well-meaning people wanted to understand the psychology of heroism, as if extraordinary actions emerged from extraordinary character rather than ordinary circumstances that happened to require unusual responses. But sitting in his kitchen, with rain against the windows and the smell of damp earth coming through the screens, Doss could remember exactly what the decision had felt like from inside. Not heroic or extraordinary, just necessary in the way that breathing was necessary. Men were calling for help, and he was a medic whose job was to help them. Everything else, the enemy fire, the failing rope, the impossible tactical situation, had been secondary to that basic arithmetic. "Don't know," he told his grandson. "Just seemed like what I was supposed to do." The boy wrote this down with the careful attention of someone who understood he was receiving important information, even if its significance remained unclear. Outside, the rain was lightening, and afternoon sun was beginning to appear through breaking clouds. "Do you ever think about them? The men you saved?" "Sometimes." What he didn't tell his grandson was how often he thought about the others, the wounded men he hadn't reached, the voices that had stopped calling before he could locate them, the faces he'd seen briefly in shell craters before enemy fire forced him to move on to casualties he could actually save. The successful rescues were part of the public record, but the failures lived in a different kind of memory that didn't make for inspiring school reports. "Do you think they remember you?" Some of them, maybe. Martinez had sent Christmas cards for 30 years before his death in 1978. Williamson had named his first son Desmond and sent photographs every birthday until the boy graduated college. Jenkins had become a minister and occasionally mentioned their cliff-face conversation in sermons about finding God in unexpected places. Walsh had never written, but his widow had sent a letter after his death saying that he'd talked about the ridge every May until the year he died. Hendricks lived in California now and called every year on the anniversary of the action. They'd talk for 10 or 15 minutes about weather, grandchildren, and the peculiar challenge of explaining war to people who'd never experienced it. Neither man mentioned the 3 hours they'd spent clinging to a limestone cliff while Japanese troops tried to dislodge them with grenades and rifle fire. "Grandpa, do you think what you did was brave?" This was the hardest question, because it touched on the difference between how the action looked from outside and how it had felt from inside. The official narrative described conscious heroism, a man choosing to risk his life repeatedly for the sake of others, motivated by courage and moral clarity that transcended normal human limitations. But Doss remembered mostly fear and confusion, interrupted by moments of practical problem-solving that had more to do with rope-handling techniques than moral philosophy. The decision to stay on the ridge had felt less like courage than like an inability to imagine alternatives. The wounded men were there, he was a medic, and leaving seemed mathematically impossible regardless of orders or tactical considerations. "Don't know," he said. "Felt more like just doing my job." His grandson finished writing and closed the composition book. Outside, the rain had stopped entirely and sunlight was streaming through the kitchen windows with the particular brightness that followed spring storms. The boy would go home and write his report about American heroism, adding Desmond Doss to a list of Medal of Honor recipients whose actions demonstrated the highest ideals of military service. But for Doss, the lasting memory wasn't of heroism or ideals. It was of hemp rope cutting into his palms, of rain against limestone, and of young men calling for help through smoke and mist on a ridge that had belonged to the enemy. The rest, the citations and ceremonies and decades of retelling, felt like stories about someone else, connected to his experience but simplified in ways that made the actual moments seem both more and less than they had been. The smell of rain against earth came through the open window, and for just a moment Doss was back on Hacksaw Ridge, listening to voices call through the mist and calculating whether one more trip across the plateau might be possible before the rope finally failed. 50 years later, he still wasn't entirely sure how those calculations had worked out, or whether the decisions he'd made that day had been courageous, necessary, or simply the only ones that allowed him to live with himself afterward. Outside, the sun was shining, and his grandson was riding his bicycle home with notes that would become a school report about heroes. The war was over, had been over for decades, but some part of it would always be with him, not the dramatic moments that made for inspiring stories, but the quieter weight of carrying other people's lives in his hands and hoping the rope would hold long enough to get them all down safely. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.